Abe Lincoln's Anecdotes and Stories by R.D. Wordsworth. Part 5. Kept up the argument. Judge T. Lyle Dickey of Illinois related that when the excitement over the Kansas-Nebraska bill first broke out, he was with Lincoln and several friends attending court. One evening several persons, including himself and Lincoln, were discussing the slavery question. Judge Dickey contended that slavery was an institution which the Constitution recognized and which could not be disturbed. Lincoln argued that ultimately slavery must become extinct. After a while, said Judge Dickey, we went upstairs to bed. There were 2 beds in our room, and I remember that Lincoln sat up in his nightshirt on the edge of the bed, arguing the point with me. At last we went to sleep. Early in the morning I woke up, and there was Lincoln half sitting up in bed. Dickey, said he, I tell you this nation cannot exist half slave and half free. Oh, Lincoln, said I, go to sleep. Thought of learning a trade. Lincoln at one time thought seriously of learning the blacksmith's trade. He was without means and felt the immediate necessity of undertaking some business that would give him bread. While entertaining this project, an event occurred which, in his undetermined state of mind, seemed to open a way to success in another quarter. Reuben Radford, keeper of a small store in the village of New Salem, had incurred the displeasure of the Clary Grove boys, who exercised their regulating prerogatives by irregularly breaking his windows. William G. Greene, a friend of young Lincoln, riding by Radford's store soon afterward, was hailed by him and told that he intended to sell out. Mr. Greene went into the store and offered him at random $400 for his stock, which offer was immediately accepted. Lincoln happened in the next day, and being familiar with the value of the goods, Mr. Greene proposed to him to take an inventory of the stock and see what sort of a bargain he had made. This he did, and it was found that the goods were worth $600. Lincoln then made an offer of $125 for his bargain, with the proposition that he and a man named Barry, as his partner, take over Greene's notes given to Radford. Mr. Greene agreed to the arrangement, but Radford declined it, except on condition that Greene would be their security. Greene at last assented. Lincoln was not afraid of the Clary Grove boys. On the contrary, they had been his most ardent friends since the time he thrashed Jack Armstrong, champion bully of the Grove, but their custom was not heavy. The business soon became a wreck. Greene had to not only assist in closing it up, but pay Radford's notes as well. Lincoln afterwards spoke of these notes, which he finally made good to Greene, as the national debt. The same old rum. One of President Lincoln's friends, visiting at the White House, was finding considerable fault with the constant agitation in Congress of the slavery question. He remarked that, after the adoption of the emancipation policy, he had hoped for something new. There was a man down in Maine, said the president in reply, who kept a grocery store, and a lot of fellows used to loaf around for their toddy. He only gave them New England rum, and they drank pretty considerable of it. But after a while they began to get tired of that, and kept asking for something new, all the time. Well, one night, when the whole crowd were around, the grocer brought out his glasses, and says he, I've got something new for you to drink, boys, now. Honor bright, says they. Honor bright, says he, and with that he sets out a jug. Thar, says he, that's something new. It's New England rum, says he. Now, remarked the president in conclusion, I guess we're a good deal like that crowd, and Congress is a good deal like that storekeeper. Couldn't let go the hog. When Governor Custer of Pennsylvania described the terrible butchery at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Mr. Lincoln was almost broken-hearted. The governor regretted that his description had so sadly affected the president. He remarked, I would give all I possess to know how to rescue you from this terrible war. Then Mr. Lincoln's wonderful recuperative powers asserted themselves, and this marvelous man was himself. Lincoln's whole aspect suddenly changed, and he relieved his mind by telling a story. This reminds me, Governor, he said, of an old farmer out in Illinois that I used to know. He took it into his head to go into hog raising. He sent out to Europe and imported the finest breed of hogs he could buy. The prize hog was put in a pen, and the farmer's 2 mischievous boys, James and John, were told to be sure not to let it out. But James, the worst of the 2, let the brute out the next day. The hog went straight for the boys and drove John up a tree. Then the hog went for the seat of James's trousers, and the only way the boy could save himself was by holding on to the hog's tail. The hog would not give up his hunt, nor the boy his hold. After they had made a good many circles around the tree, the boy's courage began to give out, and he shouted to his brother, "I say, John, come down quick and help me let go this hog. Now, Governor, that is exactly my case. I wish some one would come and help me to let the hog go." His knowledge of human nature. Once when Lincoln was pleading a case, the opposing lawyer had all the advantage of the law. The weather was warm, and his opponent, as was admissible in frontier courts, pulled off his coat and vest as he grew warm in the argument. At that time, shirts with buttons behind were unusual. Lincoln took in the situation at once. Knowing the prejudices of the primitive people against pretension of all sorts, or any affectation of superior social rank arising, he said, "Gentlemen of the jury, having justice on my side, I don't think you will be at all influenced by the gentleman's pretended knowledge of the law, when you see he does not even know which side of his shirt should be in front." There was a general laugh, and Lincoln's case was won. Took nothing but money. During the war, Congress appropriated $10,000 to be expended by the President in defending United States Marshals in cases of arrests and seizures where the legality of their actions was tested in the courts. Previously, the Marshals sought the assistance of the Attorney General in defending them, but when they found that the President had a fund for that purpose, they sought to control the money. In speaking of these Marshals one day, Mr. Lincoln said, "They are like a man in Illinois whose cabin was burned down, and according to the kindly custom of early days in the West, his neighbors all contributed something to start him again. In his case they had been so liberal that he soon found himself better off than before the fire, and he got proud. One day a neighbor brought him a bag of oats, but the fellow refused it with scorn. 'No,' said he, 'I'm not taking oats now. I take nothing but money.'" Creditor paid debtor's debt. A certain rich man in Springfield, Illinois, sued a poor attorney for $2.50, and Lincoln was asked to prosecute the case. Lincoln urged the creditor to let the matter drop, adding, "You can make nothing out of him, and it will cost you a good deal more than the debt to bring suit." The creditor was still determined to have his way, and threatened to seek some other attorney. Lincoln then said, "Well, if you are determined that suit should be brought, I will bring it, but my charge will be $10. The money was paid him, and peremptory orders were given that the suit be brought that day. After the client's departure, Lincoln went out of the office, returning in about an hour with an amused look on his face. Asked what pleased him, he replied, "I brought suit against blank," and then hunted him up, told him what I had done, handed him half of the $10, and we went over to the squire's office. He confessed judgment and paid the bill. Lincoln added that he didn't see any other way to make things satisfactory for his client as well as the other. Conscripting dead men. Mr. Lincoln, being found fault with for making another call, said that if the country required it, he would continue to do so until the matter stood as described by a Western provost marshal, who says, "I listened a short time since to a butternut-clad individual who succeeded in making good his escape, expatiate most eloquently on the rigidness with which the conscription was enforced south of the Tennessee River. His response to a question propounded by a citizen ran somewhat in this wise: 'Do they conscript close over the river? Stranger, I should think they did. They take every man who hasn't been dead more than 2 days. If this is correct, the Confederacy has at least a ghost of a chance left.'" And of another, a Methodist minister in Kansas, living on a small salary, who was greatly troubled to get his quarterly installment. He at last told the non-paying trustees that he must have his money, as he was suffering for the necessaries of life. "Money?" replied the trustees. "You preach for money? We thought you preached for the good of souls." "Souls?" responded the Reverend. "I can't eat souls, and if I could, it would take 1,000 such as yours to make a meal." "That soul is the point, sir," said the president. Major Anderson's bad memory. Among the men whom Captain Lincoln met in the Black Hawk campaign were Lieutenant Colonel Zachary Taylor, Lieutenant Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, and Lieutenant Robert Anderson, all of the United States Army. Judge Arnold, in his Life of Abraham Lincoln, relates that Lincoln and Anderson did not meet again until sometime in 1861. After Anderson had evacuated Fort Sumter, on visiting Washington, he called at the White House to pay his respects to the President. Lincoln expressed his thanks to Anderson for his conduct at Fort Sumter, and then said, "Major, do you remember of ever meeting me before?" "No, Mr. President, I have no recollection of ever having had that pleasure." "My memory is better than yours," said Lincoln. "You mustered me into the service of the United States in 1832 at Dixon's Ferry in the Black Hawk War." Settled out of court. When Abe Lincoln used to be drifting around the country, practicing law in Fulton and Menard counties, Illinois, an old fellow met him going to Lewiston, riding a horse which, while it was a serviceable enough animal, was not of the kind to be truthfully called a fine saddler. It was a weather-beaten nag, patient and plodding, and it toiled along with Abe, and Abe's books, tucked away in saddlebags, lay heavy on the horse's flank. "Hello, Uncle Tommy," said Abe. "Hello, Abe," responded Uncle Tommy. "I'm powerful glad to see you, Abe, for I'm gwine to have something for ye at Lewiston Co't, I reckon." "How's that, Uncle Tommy?" said Abe. "Well, Jim Adams, his land runs along o' mine. He's pesterin' me a heap, and I got to get the law on Jim, I reckon." "Uncle Tommy, you haven't had any fights with Jim, have you?" "No. He's a fair to middling neighbor, isn't he?" "Only tolerable, Abe." "He's been a neighbor of yours for a long time, hasn't he?" "Nigh on to 15 year. Part of the time you get along all right, don't you?" "I reckon we do, Abe." "Well, now, Uncle Tommy, you see this horse of mine? He isn't as good a horse as I could straddle, and I sometimes get out of patience with him, but I know his faults. He does fairly well as horses go, and it might take me a long time to get used to some other horse's faults, for all horses have faults. You and Uncle Jimmy must put up with each other, as I and my horse do with one another." "I reckon, Abe," said Uncle Tommy, as he bit off about 4 ounces of Missouri plug, "I reckon you're about right." And Abe Lincoln, with a smile on his gaunt face, rode on toward Lewiston. No Vanderbilt. In February 1860, not long before his nomination for the presidency, Lincoln made several speeches in Eastern cities. To an Illinois acquaintance, whom he met at the Astor House in New York, he said, "I have the cottage at Springfield and about $3,000 in money. If they make me vice president with Seward, as some say they will, I hope I shall be able to increase it to $20,000, and that is as much as any man ought to want." Lincoln mistaken for once. President Lincoln was compelled to acknowledge that he made at least one mistake in sizing up men. One day a very dignified man called at the White House, and Lincoln's heart fell when his visitor approached. The latter was portly, his face was full of apparent anxiety, and Lincoln was willing to wager a year's salary that he represented some society for the easy and speedy repression of rebellions. The caller talked fluently, but at no time did he give advice or suggest a way to put down the Confederacy. He was full of humor, told a clever story or two, and was entirely self-possessed. At length the president inquired, "You are a clergyman, are you not, sir?" "Not by a jugful," returned the stranger heartily. Grasping him by the hand, Lincoln shook it until the visitor squirmed. "You must lunch with us. I am glad to see you. I was afraid you were a preacher." "I went to the Chicago Convention," the caller said, "as a friend of Mr. Seward. I have watched you narrowly ever since your inauguration, and I called merely to pay my respects. What I want to say is this. I think you are doing everything for the good of the country that is in the power of man to do. You are on the right track. As one of your constituents, I now say to you, do in future as you please, and I will support you." This was spoken with tremendous effect. "Why," said Mr. Lincoln in great astonishment, "I took you to be a preacher. I thought you had come here to tell me how to take Richmond," and he again grasped the hand of his strange visitor. Accurate and penetrating as Mr. Lincoln's judgment was concerning men, for once he had been wholly mistaken. The scene was comical in the extreme. The two men stood gazing at each other. A smile broke from the lips of the solemn wag, and rippled over the wide expanse of his homely face like sunlight overspreading a continent, and Mr. Lincoln was convulsed with laughter. He stayed to lunch. Done with the Bible. Lincoln never told a better story than this. A country meeting house that was used once a month was quite a distance from any other house. The preacher, an old-line Baptist, was dressed in coarse linen pantaloons and shirt of the same material. The pants, manufactured after the old fashion, with baggy legs and a flap in the front, were made to attach to his frame without the aid of suspenders. A single button held his shirt in position, and that was at the collar. He rose up in the pulpit and with a loud voice announced his text thus, "I am the Christ whom I shall represent today." About this time a little blue lizard ran up his roomy pantaloons. The old preacher, not wishing to interrupt the steady flow of his sermon, slapped away on his leg, expecting to arrest the intruder, but his efforts were unavailing, and the little fellow kept on ascending higher and higher. Continuing the sermon, the preacher loosened the central button which graced the waistband of his pantaloons, and with a kick off came that easy-fitting garment. But meanwhile Mr. Lizard had passed the equatorial line of the waistband, and was calmly exploring that part of the preacher's anatomy which lay underneath the back of his shirt. Things were now growing interesting, but the sermon was still grinding on. The next movement on the preacher's part was for the collar button, and with one sweep of his arm off came the tow linen shirt. The congregation sat for an instant as if dazed. At length one old lady in the rear part of the room rose up, and glancing at the excited object in the pulpit, shouted at the top of her voice, "If you represent Christ, then I'm done with the Bible." Satisfaction to the soul. In the faraway days when Abe went to school in Indiana, they had exercises, exhibitions, and speaking meetings in the schoolhouse or the church, and Abe was the star. His father was a Democrat, and at that time Abe agreed with his parent. He would frequently make political and other speeches to the boys, and explain tangled questions. Boonville was the county seat of Warwick County, situated about 15 miles from Gentryville. Thither Abe walked to be present at the sittings of the court, and listened attentively to the trials and the speeches of the lawyers. One of the trials was that of a murderer. He was defended by Mr. John Breckenridge, and at the conclusion of his speech Abe was so enthusiastic that he ventured to compliment him. Breckenridge looked at the shabby boy, thanked him, and passed on his way. Many years afterwards, in 1862, Breckenridge called on the president, and he was told, "It was the best speech that I, up to that time, had ever heard. If I could, as I then thought, make as good a speech as that, my soul would be satisfied." His teeth chattered. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, the latter accused Lincoln of having, when in Congress, voted against the appropriation for supplies to be sent the United States soldiers in Mexico. In reply, Lincoln said, "This is a perversion of the facts. I was opposed to the policy of the administration in declaring war against Mexico, but when war was declared I never failed to vote for the support of any proposition looking to the comfort of our poor fellows who were maintaining the dignity of our flag in a war that I thought unnecessary and unjust." He gradually became more and more excited. His voice thrilled and his whole frame shook. Sitting on the stand was O.B. Ficklin, who had served in Congress with Lincoln in 1847. Lincoln reached back, took Ficklin by the coat collar back of his neck, and in no gentle manner lifted him from his seat as if he had been a kitten, and roared, "Fellow citizens, here is Ficklin, who was at that time in Congress with me, and he knows it is a lie." He shook Ficklin until his teeth chattered. Fearing he would shake Ficklin's head off, Ward Layman grasped Lincoln's hand and broke his grip. After the speaking was over, Ficklin, who had warm personal friendship with him, said, "Lincoln, you nearly shook all the democracy out of me today." Profanity as a safety valve. Lincoln never indulged in profanity, but confessed that when Lee was beaten at Malvern Hill, after 7 days of fighting, and Richmond, but 12 miles away, was at McClellan's mercy, he felt very much like swearing when he learned that the Union general had retired to Harrison's Landing. Lee was so confident his opponent would not go to Richmond that he took his army into Maryland, a move he would not have made had an energetic fighting man been in McClellan's place. It is true, McClellan followed and defeated Lee in the bloodiest battle of the war, Antietam, afterwards following him into Virginia, but Lincoln could not bring himself to forgive the general's inaction before Richmond. A Stagecoach Story. The following is told by Thomas H. Nelson of Terre Haute, Indiana, who was appointed minister to Chile by Lincoln. Judge Abram Hammond, afterwards governor of Indiana, and myself had arranged to go from Terre Haute to Indianapolis in a stagecoach. As we stepped in, we discovered that the entire back seat was occupied by a long, lank individual, whose head seemed to protrude from one end of the coach and his feet from the other. He was the sole occupant and was sleeping soundly. Hammond slapped him familiarly on the shoulder and asked him if he had chartered the coach that day. Certainly not, and he at once took the front seat, politely giving us the place of honor and comfort. An odd-looking fellow he was, with a 25-cent hat, without vest or cravat. Regarding him as a good subject for merriment, we perpetrated several jokes. He took them all with utmost innocence and good nature, and joined in the laugh, although at his own expense. After an astounding display of wordy pyrotechnics, the dazed and bewildered stranger asked, "What will be the upshot of this comet business?" Late in the evening we reached Indianapolis, and hurried to Browning's Hotel, losing sight of the stranger altogether. We retired to our room to brush our clothes. In a few minutes I descended to the portico, and there descried our long, gloomy fellow traveler in the center of an admiring group of lawyers, among whom were Judges McLean and Huntington, Albert S. White, and Richard W. Thompson, who seemed to be amused and interested in a story he was telling. I inquired of Browning, the landlord, who he was. "Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, a member of Congress," was his response. I was thunderstruck at the announcement. I hastened upstairs and told Hammond the startling news, and together we emerged from the hotel by a back door and went down an alley to another house, thus avoiding further contact with our distinguished fellow traveler. Years afterward, when the President-elect was on his way to Washington, I was in the same hotel, looking over the distinguished party, when a long arm reached to my shoulder and a shrill voice exclaimed, "Hello, Nelson, do you think, after all, the whole world is going to follow the darn thing off?" The words were my own in answer to his question in the stagecoach. The speaker was Abraham Lincoln. Sentinel obeyed orders. A slight variation of the traditional sentry story is related by C.C. Buell. It was a cold, blusterous winter night, says Mr. Buell. Mr. Lincoln emerged from the front door, his lank figure bent over as he drew tightly about his shoulders the shawl which he employed for such protection, for he was on his way to the War Department at the west corner of the grounds, where in times of battle he was wont to get the midnight dispatches from the field. As the blast struck him, he thought of the numbness of the pacing sentry and turned to him, said, "Young man, you've got a cold job tonight. Step inside and stand guard there." "My orders keep me out here," the soldier replied. "Yes," said the President in his argumentative tone, "but your duty can be performed just as well inside as out here, and you'll oblige me by going in." "I have been stationed outside," the soldier answered, and resumed his beat. "Hold on there," said Mr. Lincoln as he turned back again. "It occurs to me that I am Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and I order you to go inside." Was going to be hitched. Abe's nephew, or one of them, related a story in connection with Lincoln's first love, Anne Rutledge, and his subsequent marriage to Miss Mary Todd. This nephew was a plain, everyday farmer, and thought everything of his uncle, whose greatness he quite thoroughly appreciated, although he did not pose to any extreme as the relative of a President of the United States. Said he one day, in telling his story, "Us children, when we heard Uncle Abe was a-going to be married, asked Grandma if Uncle Abe never had a gal afore, and she says she, 'Well, Abe, Was never a hand nohow to run around visiting much, or go with the gals neither. But he did fall in love with Anne Rutledge, who lived out near Springfield, and after she died he'd come home, and every time he'd talk about her he cried dreadful. He never could talk of her nohow, though he'd just cry and cry, like a young feller. Once he told Grandma they was going to be hitched. They haven't promised each other, and that is all we ever heard about it. But so it was that arter Uncle Abe had got over his mournin', he was married to a woman which had lived down in Kentuck. Uncle Abe hisself told us he was married the next time he came up to our place, and when we asked him why he didn't bring his wife up to see us, he said, "She's very busy and can't come." But we knowed better than that. He was too proud to bring her up, 'cause nothing would suit her nohow. She wasn't raised the way we was, and was different from us, and we heard too she was as proud as could be. No, and he never brought none of the children neither. But then Uncle Abe, he wasn't to blame. We never thought he was stuck up. End of section 5. End of Abe Lincoln's Anecdotes and Stories by R.D. Wordsworth.